It's an honor and a privilege to be invited back, I so am grateful to Johnny, Jeanette, the elders of the church for the kind invitation. You folks are just brimming with hospitality here in North Carolina, and I'm eating well, and your warmth and kindness is a real part of your DNA here. You know, one thing I do want to just share with you as we close the gap a little bit and keep getting increasingly acquainted. Johnny, for decades, was a faculty member in many of our colleges and seminaries. His teaching has impacted the lives of thousands, literally thousands of men and women who have gone out to serve the Lord in different places across the country and around the world. I've got a number of degrees, and I have to tell you, I've sat for many a class, and out of all of those degrees and all of those classes, Dr. Johnny Presley had the greatest impact on my life, shaping my theology, shaping my interior world, impacting my ministry. He allowed me in assignment after assignment to take it back to Indian Creek Christian Church, the Creek in Indianapolis, and apply it in a practical way where I was. So all of those term papers I had to write, all of those assignments I had to complete, he allowed me to use those in the local church. So if you would join me, could you show appreciation to your preacher and my dear friend, Johnny Presley? It's just a delight. And you know, God has a sense of humor. I believe that for a long time. God has a sense of humor. So last year when he invited me down, I had this incredible breakfast in their home, in their dining room, and Johnny was sitting across from me. He was asking me question after question about leading a church. I've been, a preacher for 38 years leading in the local church, and I've learned a few things through the School of Hard Knocks, and he's pelting me with all of these questions about being a preacher in a church, and I just I looked at him across the table, and I said, Dr. Presley, it's now your turn to take notes. And so God has got a great sense of humor. We're going to be in Acts chapter 27, all right? So if you would turn with me in your Bibles to Acts chapter 27, and there we're going to look at a guy who had been caught in a storm. We're going to talk about storms today for a few moments, and as we do so, let me just also close the gap a little bit. Leah, my wife, 41 years, we like to travel. It's one of our hobbies, and I remember on one of our trips to some state, we were in a gift shop. We would normally buy Christmas tree ornaments from across the country, around the world. And so we got this ginormous tree in our home every holiday season, and it brings back memories. Well, we're in this shop, and I'm in one part of the shop. Leah's a few aisles over, and all of a sudden, I just start laughing. Ho, 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 I mean out loud, roaring. I've got this sign in my hand. She comes running down the aisle. You're embarrassing me. And I go, look at this sign. She said, what's so funny? Look at this sign. And the sign said, I want to live life in the fast lane, but I'm married to a speed bump. And Leah did not see the humor in that sign whatsoever. You will not buy that sign, she said, and I didn't. I'm a good husband, did not buy that sign. You and I are going to be in a text. We're going to put the pedal to the metal, and we're going to move into that text, but we're going to pause for 3 speed bumps. And the reason doing so, this book of unchanging truth speaks into our lives. And we're to be more than hearers of the word. What are we to be? We're to be doers of the word. So we're going to slow down for those 3 speed bumps, and we're going to hear from Paul Storm how it speaks into our lives. Here we go, chapter 27 of the book of Acts. I'm going to begin reading this time in verse 13. Now, wait. Context before content. So before we read any portion of these verses, here's the context. Paul is on his way to Rome. And why? Because earlier in Acts, he had been arrested in Jerusalem. There was a murder plot to take him out. And what he did in that moment, word became known to the commander, and the commander moved Paul to a city called Caesarea along the Mediterranean Sea. And it was there in Caesarea that Paul pleaded his case before some people of authority, and when they would not release him, he said, I appeal to Caesar. And then that person said, then to Caesar you will go. This then is this journey of Paul to Rome. He's on a ship on his way to Rome to stand trial before Caesar. That's where we pick up verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, They thought they had obtained what they wanted, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind. So we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. When the men had hoisted it aboard, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. Fearing that they would run aground on the sandbars of Syrtis, they lowered the sea anchor and they let the ship be driven along. We took such a violent battering from the storm that the next day they began to throw the cargo overboard. On the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. We're going to stop there. Here's a portion we're going to dig into and make some discoveries. Paul found himself in the midst of a storm. Now, there are two traits of a storm that we want to understand. First of all, this storm in his life was sudden. Paul did not have an app on his phone for the Weather Channel. He did not have radar, Doppler radar, to know that a low pressure system was on its way. This storm suddenly came against that ship out of left field. And not only was it sudden, but secondly, it was serious. So serious that they took actions to try to keep that boat afloat. For example, it says that they hoisted, verse 17, the lifeboat aboard. They passed ropes under the ship itself to hold it together. That ship, obviously made out of wood, was pulling apart. They're trying to keep this boat together. And it was a big boat, a ship. There were 276 men on that ship. We read a little bit later on in the 27th chapter of Acts. So it was a large ship in that day. They're trying to keep it together. They're fearing that that ship will literally be pulled apart by the crashing of the waves against that ship. And not only that, verse 18, they're throwing the cargo overboard, hoping to make the ship lighter to keep it afloat. And not only that, but in verse 19, on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Tackle. I was born in Muskegon, Michigan. Here's the mitten. Muskegon, Michigan, right on Lake Michigan. And as a boy growing up, people would spend all their time at the big lake. We would sail, catamarans, etc. And tackle means the roping, the rigging, the cables, the sails themselves of a boat. These sailors are throwing over the side of that ship the very means of their propulsion if they were to be saved. And this whole storm could be summed up in one single word in Greek, and it's the word tuphonikos. It says right there, verse 14, before very long, a wind of hurricane force, tuphonikos. What do you think that word means in Greek or in English? Typhoon, typhoon. It's from which we derive our English word typhoon. So a typhoon that is ginormous in scope. It has bands of weather reaching out from it, much like a hurricane, much like Hurricane Florence that decimated the Carolinas not long ago, causing tens of millions of dollars of damage, even claiming lives in the Carolinas. That's the kind of a storm that Paul suddenly found himself in, one that was so serious that it threatened life. Now, we're going to come to this first speed bump. Here's the speed bump. How does that speak into our lives? The same happens to us. You and I are going to find ourselves from time to time caught suddenly in a storm that we did not see coming, and it will be serious of nature. What might that look like? Well, even our family. This year, 2019, we have two sons. Leah and I, both sons, are married. They're in the ministry. We have 6 grandkids. And our sons married followers of Jesus, daughters-in-law who love the Lord, and together with their husbands are raising these 6 kids to follow Jesus. Both of our daughters-in-law in their 30s this year were diagnosed with cancer. Serious, life-threatening cancer. We did not see that coming. And last December, the week before Christmas, I buried Shauna's mother, a member of the Creek, who had battled cancer for only 6 weeks from her diagnosis. Our family has been decimated by a sudden, serious storm. It happens to all of us. It might be in a marriage where a husband or a wife turn to one another. I want a divorce. Well, where was that coming from? I found somebody younger, prettier. Found somebody much more handsome, more rich. I'm out of here. I don't love you anymore. I'm out of here. And suddenly, this serious storm has a far-reaching impact, like throwing a rock into a pond. There's a ripple effect. And that doesn't affect just the husband and the wife. That affects children in a huge way. And not only children, but the parents of that couple. And not only the parents of that couple, the siblings and the friends and the co-workers. You see, a storm will have bands that reach far and wide. Maybe it's a financial storm. That for whatever reason, we go into work on a Monday morning, hey, pink slip, lost your job. And because we lost this job suddenly without warning, we are in serious financial hot water. There are all manner of storms that you and I've got to understand happen in life. We will experience storms, most assuredly. How do we know that? Jesus said so in John chapter 16, verse 33. The night before he goes to the cross, he turns to his guys and he says, in this world, you will have trouble. Not maybe, not perhaps, not might. No, you will have trouble. He goes on to say, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And not only did Jesus say that, but his half-brother James, same mom, different dads, his half-brother James said in James chapter 1, verse 2, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kind. Whenever means you most certainly will face trials of many kinds, shapes and sizes, and you consider it pure joy when it happens, so very suddenly. Paul the apostle on death row, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, he said, but mark this. Now in Greek, that phrase grammatically, but mark this, it means listen up, there's a big one coming. But Paul was about to write in his letter on death row, he was about to say something incredibly powerful. But mark this, don't let it go in one ear and out the other, but mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. And whenever Paul used the phrase last days, he's not referring to just a few days before Jesus Christ comes back, splitting the clouds and every eye see him. No, last days in the mind of Paul meant any day after the cross, the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Those are the last days. From the moment Jesus was raised from the dead, when he ascended into heaven, we now enter into the last days. And Paul says, there will be terrible times in the last days. Mark this. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7. He says, these trials, these storms, these sufferings, these trials have come so that your faith may be proved genuine. My faith may be proved genuine. God is expecting me in the midst of this storm with my daughters-in-law to hold on to him, that my faith will be real. He's expecting you, every storm that comes upon you suddenly and without warning, he expects you to be faithful, not to be angry with him, not to shake a fist of blame at God. Storms don't come from God, people. Suffering, evil, comes from our enemy. He's the author of disease and death, not God. God is our loving Father in the heavenly lights from whom good gifts come. So when those storms strike, he wants to see how we're going to respond. Will we hold on in faith or not? All right, there's our first discovery as we move into this story, this text, this journey with Paul. Let's get over that bump now, that speed bump, put the pedal to the metal. Notice in verse 9, back into the text, more of the journey. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the fast. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo and to our own lives also. Verse 11, but the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot, the captain of the ship, the pilot, and of the owner of the ship. The centurion is the guy calling the shots. Centurion, an officer in the Roman military, centurion, meaning 100, meaning he had 100 soldiers under his command. This guy had all authority on that ship to say, sail or not. And he tells the pilot, he tells the owner of the ship, we're sailing. Didn't listen to Paul. He let it go in one ear and out the other. Now, watch this. In verse 21, after the men had gone a long time without food, many days had passed. As a matter of fact, just glance in 33. Before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, this was a 2-week Mediterranean cruise. For 14 days. We're not just talking about a storm one night. The sun, the moon, the stars, they could not be seen because the clouds were thick and heavy. The wind was so strong. The water was forever crashing over the side of that ship. They were throwing pieces of the ship overboard. And after the men, verse 21, had gone without food, Paul stood up before them and said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. In other words, I told you so. That's exactly correct. Na, 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 na. I told you so. That's exactly what he could have said, but he didn't. This storm was completely, here it is, avoidable. 2 types of storms. The first one avoidable. They did not have to go through this great damage and loss. Completely avoidable. They brought it on themselves. Now there's also here another layer to this story. Let's put a marker here in 27 of Acts and just go back with me a few pages to Acts chapter 23. And what you and I want to see here is a conversation between Jesus and Paul. In chapter 23, in verse 11, the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, red ink in my Bible, these are the words of Jesus. The Lord stood near Paul and said, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. It was God's plan for Paul to stand trial in front of Caesar and to tell Caesar the good news of Jesus Christ. That was God's plan. So a second type of a storm happens to be opposite of avoidable. It happens to be what? Unavoidable. There are some storms in life that are unavoidable. That God has a purpose afoot in that storm. Now we're coming up to the second speed bump. We got to talk about this. We have to unpack this. It's very important. The same is true about us today, 21 centuries later. There are avoidable and unavoidable storms. Mike Howerton is a preacher and a writer. I got a book of his in my office back in Indianapolis. And in the book, Mike tells a story from his high school days when he and his buddies, they were playing football. They loved to play football, tackle football just out in the field. One day it rained and it rained and it rained. Finally, it stopped raining and the sun came out, and they got together to play mud football in a gully. Mud football. And in the book he writes, man, it was incredible. The mud was inches deep, and it was just within minutes. We were covered with mud head to foot. It was phenomenal. So much fun. And he said, I was at the scrimmage line looking at the guy about to hike the ball, and I saw something there on his shoulder. And I leaned in and I looked, and I took a whiff, and I said, that's toilet paper. We are playing in poop water. And what had happened, the city sewers had overflowed into that gully, and they were playing in raw sewage. Didn't get a clue. And so they screamed, oh, we're playing in poop water, and they ran off, obviously. When I read that in his book, I got to thinking, we all too often are playing in poop water. We have made a mess of our lives because all too often the storms that we struggle with are avoidable, completely avoidable. It's as simple as A, B, C to understand this. A, attitudes. B, behaviors. C, choices. Let me just unpack that with you. Attitudes are how we think. It's inside of us, an attitude, how we think. And attitudes lead to behavior. And that behavior then leads us to making certain choices. Think with me in the Old Testament. There was a guy by the name of King David. Remember him? And he should have been off to war in the spring of the year with his soldiers. He stayed home. He's out on his balcony, and he sees this beautiful woman in a hot tub. And he sends for her. He says, you go get her. You bring her to me. But you and I need to understand. What was that woman's name, by the way? What was her name? Bathsheba. So Bathsheba is brought into the bedroom of King David, and the king orders her into his bed. This was sexual assault. Because you had somebody in absolute authority. You did not tell the king what to do. It would have been off with your head had you disobeyed the king. And so now David, he's got this attitude, I want her. I want her. It's called lust. And that attitude inside of him, how he was thinking, led him to bad boy behavior that was pretty significant. And you know the rest of the story. There's a baby that's coming now as a result of that act of sexual assault. There are some choices that David made. Attitude, lust, resulting in bad boy behavior, some choices that he made. Think with me, top 10 list. And I'm not talking about David Letterman, hometown Indianapolis. I'm talking about the original top 10 list, and that would be God's. Remember one of those from the top 10 list? Thou shalt not covet another man's wife. Oh, choice. David, he made a choice to covet another man's wife. Check that one off. Oh, hey, remember? Do not steal. It looks like he stole another man's wife. Check that one off. Do not commit what? Adultery. Check that one off. And then he finds out she's pregnant. What does he do? He brings Uriah, her husband, home from the war front. He tries to get him to go sleep with his wife to try to make him think that that baby in her belly is his. That doesn't work, and that's all a sham. Do not tell a lie. Check that one off. And then when he can't get Uriah to buy into that one, what does he do? He sends a letter in Uriah's own hand back to the war front, and he puts Uriah on the front line, and all of the soldiers are pulled back from him, and Uriah is what in battle? Killed in battle. Thou shalt not kill. Boy, you can check that one off. You talk about attitude leading to bad boy behavior. If his parents were alive at that time, there's another commandment: honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the earth that the Lord your God has given to you. This is the first commandment with a promise. Check that one off. You and I got to understand all of the consequences. Though he was forgiven of that sin, there were pretty meaty consequences as a result of that. Forgiven, but he was going to pay the price of playing around, and it was all completely avoidable. Completely avoidable. And what happened long ago, thousands of years ago, in that Word of God, if people tell me, oh, Gary, you believe in this book, this old-fashioned, out-of-date, irrelevant book, yeah, I sure do, because it looks just like life today. What happened to David happens to us. Here's an example. Attitude, A, B, C, attitude. Oh, I just love more. The myth of more. More is never enough. I want a bigger house. I want a newer car. I want shinier toys, a nicer boat to go out on the river. I want designer duds, blue jeans that cost $130, designer purse bags, etc., etc. I buy into the myth of more. More is never enough. If that's the way I think, then B, bad boy behavior. I start spending money I don't have. It's called credit. Getting a loan, using Plastic Fantastic. I spend money I don't have to buy things I don't need to impress people I don't know, right? And those choices even lead to destruction financially. If the bottom falls out on the market, if I lose my job, they repossess the truck, they take my home, I can't pay my bills, my electricity is shut off. That financial implosion, all of that storm is completely what? Avoidable. See how that works? Many times, the problems we have in marriage and family, the storms that come upon us, the storms that come upon us financially, even physically in our lives, completely avoidable. That financial storm, what if I had learned to be content with what I had, whether living in plenty or in want? Philippians chapter 4, verse 11 and following. If that's my attitude, A, I have learned to be content with what I have. Don't need another thing. I can avoid that financial storm. Unavoidable. Joseph, Genesis, a man who had a coat of what? Many colors. Remember that one? Many colors. Sold into slavery at the age of 17 by his brothers. Got out of prison at the age of 30, became second in command in Egypt. He was vice president of Egypt. After his dad dies, he rescues his brothers, their families, even his aged dad. His dad dies. They're in Egypt. They take him home. They have an incredible funeral. And then they go back to Egypt, and his brothers are worried. Oh, Joseph now, with dad dead, he's going to get revenge on us. And in chapter 50 of Genesis, verse 20, this is what he says to his brothers. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, which is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph knew that that suffering was unavoidable. God used him to save many lives during those 7 years of famine. It was unavoidable. God had a greater purpose. Listen, church, some storms are going to come upon us that are unavoidable. The two types of cancer that my daughters-in-law have are not due to poor health. They're not due to being irresponsible with the body. Completely unavoidable. But God's got a greater purpose in these storms right now for his glory and honor. Romans chapter 8, do you remember verse 28? All things work for the good of those who love the Lord and are called according to his good purpose. All things will work for God's got a plan. God's got a purpose. So just remember, you and I, there are going to be storms. They're going to be sudden, many times serious, oftentimes avoidable, sometimes unavoidable. All right, we're over that second speed bump. Now here we go. Last part of the journey, back into the text, put pedal to the metal. Here we go. Acts chapter 27, check this out. Notice, it says in verse 33, before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, you've been in constant suspense. They were worried about dying, drowning in that raging sea. You've gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you, take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. He's telling them, you're all going to live. Nobody will drown. He says in verse 35, after he said this, he took some bread and he gave thanks to whom? To God. He gave thanks to God in front of them all. 276 men on this ship. The vast majority of them are unbelievers. They have not a clue who God is. They are pagans. And he's giving thanks to God in front of them. Thank you, God, for this food. And not only that, but then he says, and then he broke it and they began to eat. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. Altogether, there were 276 of us on board. Now, stop right there. Go back, though, now to verse 21. Before I read this paragraph, you got to picture it in your mind. It's dark. There's no sun. There's no moon. There are no stars. The rain is pelting. The waves are crashing over that boat. That boat is bobbing up and down. They're puking their guts out over the side of that boat. There's no Dramamine. The wind is howling, creating waves that are monster waves. The ship is creaking, coming apart. And so over that howling wind, in the midst of that darkness, Paul does not have a microphone. Got it? And there are 276 men. There are more men on this ship than are in this room right now. And so this is what it would be like. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and he said, men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. But now I urge you, keep up your courage. Not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me, and he said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. That's what it would have been like. And they all survived the storm. Everyone survived. And listen now, they survived because of two types of faith. We will survive storms if we practice two types of faith. It's right here in the text. Listen carefully. If you are in the midst of a storm right now, listen up. First service in this room, Somebody left sobbing. They're in the midst of a storm, and they found great hope in this story. Happened in the last service. Somebody left crying. Gary, pray for me, please. I'm in a storm. They found hope. If you're here today and you are in the midst of a storm, listen to how you survive the storm. And if you are not in a storm, you just remember this, because someday you will what? You're going to be in one. And maybe you and I have friends. I've got 2 daughters-in-law in the midst of a storm. I have sons who are concerned for their wives. I have grandchildren who are worried about their moms. There are people in my life who are in the midst of a storm. It might be that you have people who you know and love at home, at work, at school, in your neighborhood. Here's what you're going to do with that person. You ready? Okay, we're going to go over the speed bump here in just a minute. So Paul has here a faith that's not in the captain of the ship, the pilot, the owner of the ship, the centurion, not even in the ropes going under the ship. He says, I have faith in God. That's an anchored faith. An anchored faith in God. It says in Hebrews, without faith, it is impossible to please whom? God. You and I have to have faith in God. So if we are in the storm, or somebody we love is in the midst of the storm, we must anchor our faith in God. Yes, medicine is important. Yes, surgical procedures are necessary. Yes, a financial buyout may have to happen. Yes, getting a person to help me find a job might be necessary. Yes, going to an attorney might be necessary to deal with this divorce that is looming on the horizon. Yes, all of those things are important. But ultimately, our faith is not in attorneys. Our faith is not in a financial rescue. Our faith is not in the surgeon or in pharmaceuticals. Our faith has to be anchored where? In God. In God, first and foremost. It's essential. You know, Henry Dempsey, a pilot of what was once called Eastern Airlines, right here along the East Coast, Eastern Airlines. He's a brother of ours in Christ, a Christian. Henry was flying a small commuter jet from Maine to Boston. It was empty. He and his co-pilot were returning that plane to Boston. They got out over the Atlantic, 4,000 feet in elevation, when they heard something in the passenger compartment. Henry got up from the pilot's seat, the captain's seat. He said, fly the plane, I'm going to go check on that sound. When he walked into the fuselage, they hit some turbulence, and Henry fell against the door of that plane. The door flew open, and Henry flew out. An alarm went off in the cockpit, and the co-pilot radioed back asking for permission to land that plane. Emergency, emergency. Got permission. He gave the coordinates. We are at this place 4,000 feet above the ocean. Captain Dempsey is below in the ocean. Send the Coast Guard immediately. The co-pilot is bringing the plane in. It's at 180 miles an hour. As he's landing that plane on that concrete runway, he brings the plane to a stop at the gate. There are all of these emergency vehicles there. And the co-pilot undoes his seatbelt. He gets out of the plane, and he comes up to the plane's door. That passenger jet had steps built into that door. I'm sure you've seen that size of a jet before. And that door, when it flew open, Henry had the presence of mind to hold on to the handles. So when he comes to the door, the co-pilot, he looks down, and there's Henry holding on to the door handles. And the paramedics, they had to pry Henry's fingers loose. He was in a state of shock in that moment. When that plane landed at 180 miles an hour, his head was less than 12 inches from that concrete. It's an incredible story. Henry Dempsey had one of 2 decisions when a storm, serious storm, suddenly struck without warning. Let go and die, or hold on and live. Hold on and live. When those storms come, friends, hold on to God and live. Hold on to God and live. Second kind of faith. Did you notice Paul is talking to all those unbelievers? Keep up your courage, men. I've got faith in God that it will happen just as he said. Not a hair of your head will be lost. Not a single person will die. You're all going to live. God told me so. He has an active faith. There's the second one. He's giving that faith away. He's pointing people in the direction of God. You and I, when we have friends, loved ones in the midst of a storm, keep pointing them to God. In Luke chapter 5, verse 20, incredible text. I want you to write it down. Look it up right now. This is where there's a paralytic. He's on a mat. He hears that Jesus is coming to town to have a meeting, and his buddies take him on that mat. He can't walk. He's paralyzed, and they look up at the house, and the house is surrounded by people and crammed with people. There's no way that he can get to Jesus. Who knows, but maybe in that moment he was on his elbows with excitement, and when he saw the crowd and realized he would never get to Jesus, he might have fallen back in utter discouragement. But his buddies say, come on now. We're going to get you to Jesus. Where did they take him? Where was it? Up where? On the roof. And they go take him up on the roof. They dig through. They lower him down right in front of Jesus. I hope I get to see instant replay of that someday. I bet there was this huge smile on our Jesus' face. And Jesus forgives him of his sin and heals him in that moment. And here's what's so important for you and I to notice in that story. Verse 20, chapter 5, book of Luke. When he, meaning Jesus, when he saw their faith, the faith of the four buddies, to take him up on a roof, to dig through that roof, when he saw their faith, oh, it made all the difference. It might be that that loved one of yours and mine has no faith or little faith, and we draw alongside and we build up their faith, pointing them to God. One of the trips our family made years ago when the boys were growing up, we went to California. We camped in the redwoods. We're all about camping and hiking and climbing, etc. And so we were camping in the redwoods, and a ranger said, you know what, these trees, 30 stories tall, 330 feet in height, you'd think that they have deep, deep roots. And he said they don't. They have roots that go out in a very shallow ground for hundreds of feet in every direction. And these trees, those trees, many of them started growing when Jesus lived and walked on this earth 2,100 years ago. And the storm upon storm has come, struck, blown against those trees. Lightning has struck, but those trees keep standing in the midst of the storm. Why? Because the roots spread out and they hold each other up in the midst of the storm, the ranger said. And that's what we must do with one another. When life-threatening, serious storms strike suddenly, whether they're avoidable or unavoidable, let's not pass judgment. It's not ours to judge. We need to be there to actively point people to God with our faith anchored in God. And God's people say what? It all boils down to this. Here it is. All in a single statement. Ready? Bottom line. Don't let the storms take your faith. Make your faith take the storms. Pray with me, please.